In 1971, the United States of America faced a moment no one saw coming. Not on a battlefield, not in the halls of Congress, but in silence, behind closed doors. It was the moment the dollar, the foundation of America's power, was seconds away from dying. This story is not taught in schools. You'll never hear it in political speeches. But it shaped your life, your job, your future, and even the price of everything you buy today. Let's rewind. After World War II, the world was broken. Cities were burned to the ground. Economies collapsed. People were starving. But one nation stood tall. The United States of America. America had factories, power, innovation, and most importantly, it had gold. A lot of it. And so, the world looked to America for leadership. A deal was made, the Bretton Woods Agreement. It set the rules for all global money. It declared, the US dollar is as good as gold. From that moment, every currency on earth was tied to the dollar. And the dollar was tied to gold. Other nations trusted America because they believed the dollar meant something real. If they held dollars, they held value. The system worked, for a while. But trust is fragile. As the years passed, America's spending grew. Wars needed funding. Programs needed money. Budgets stretched beyond reality. And slowly, quietly, America began doing something dangerous. It started printing money that was not backed by gold. Dollars were flowing out into the world. But gold was not. And other countries began to notice. Their confidence wavered. They started asking questions America didn't want to answer. If your dollar is backed by gold, can we have the gold? France didn't just ask. They sent a warship to New York to collect their gold physically. Britain soon followed. Italy, Germany. One by one, nations lined up. They were holding US dollars. But they no longer wanted paper. They wanted the real thing, gold. Suddenly, the United States was cornered. If all that gold was taken, the dollar would collapse. America would lose its financial throne, its dominance, its power. And then came the moment that changed history. August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon stepped in front of the cameras to make an announcement that would rewrite the global economy forever. What he said next was never supposed to be reversed, never supposed to be forgotten. But it changed everything, and that is where this story truly begins. August 15, 1971. President Nixon walks toward the podium. The world is watching, though they don't know why. The United States is on the edge of a financial cliff, and almost nobody realizes it. Nixon clears his throat, looks into the camera, and speaks 9 words that will change the world forever. I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Just like that, the promise was broken. The foundation of the global economy erased. The dollar no longer represented gold. It represented something far more fragile. Trust. There was no vote, no warning, no long debate in Congress. Just one televised announcement, and the world's financial system flipped upside down. American citizens couldn't fully understand it. Most didn't even notice anything changed. But foreign governments, they understood perfectly. The dollar was now paper, no longer a claim to gold, just a claim to faith. This moment became known as the Nixon shock. Not because the speech was shocking, but because the consequences were. Everything had changed. The U.S. could now print money without limits. There was no more anchor, no more restraint. No more physical law behind the dollar. Money became an idea. Economists argued it was necessary. America was running out of gold. It couldn't survive under the old system. They said it was only temporary. But history teaches something every empire forgets. There is nothing more permanent than a temporary government policy. The new era began slowly. Prices started creeping up. Inflation took hold. Ordinary Americans felt it quietly, even as experts claimed everything was under control. But outside America, a different fear was growing. Countries asked, if the dollar isn't backed by gold anymore, why should we use it? This was the moment the dollar stood naked, exposed, vulnerable. If global trust collapsed, so would America's power. The U.S. had lost the gold standard, but it needed another foundation. Something strong enough to restore belief. Something the entire world would depend on. And so, a new idea began to form. A plan of pure geopolitical genius. Gold was gone, but there was something even more valuable that every nation needed to survive. Every city, every army, every business. Oil. And soon, oil would become the new gold. The year is 1973. The world is shaken. The gold standard has vanished. And now, another crisis hits. The oil embargo. Arab nations cut off oil supplies to the West. Gas lines wrap around city blocks. Prices explode overnight. Americans wait for hours just to fill half a tank. It looks like chaos, but behind the scenes, something far bigger is unfolding. The U.S. knows one thing. Without global trust in the dollar, America could lose everything. Its financial power, its military power, its influence over the world. The clock is ticking. The dollar needs a new reason to exist. A new foundation. A new promise. So the U.S. government sends men to the Middle East. Not soldiers, but strategists. They had one mission. Find a way to tie the dollar to something the world cannot live without. And they found it. In the sands of Saudi Arabia. The deal was simple, but brilliant. A secret agreement that changed everything. The U.S. told the Saudi royal family, "We will protect you. We will supply you with weapons. We will guard your oil fields. As long as you do one thing. Price your oil in U.S. dollars. Only U.S. dollars." And in 1974, Saudi Arabia agreed. From that moment on, every country on earth that needed oil needed U.S. dollars first. Japan needed dollars. Europe needed dollars. India needed dollars. China needed dollars. The world needed energy. And energy was priced only in dollars. This was the birth of something new. The petrodollar system. And it was genius. Because it forced the world to hold American currency. Nations began storing billions in U.S. dollars. They bought U.S. Treasury bonds. They kept their savings in American banks. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by oil, military power, and global necessity. But hidden in this victory was a dangerous cost, a silent trap that would later come back to haunt America. Because this new system didn't just give the U.S. power, it also gave the U.S. a weakness. Now, the value of the dollar no longer depended on gold. It depended on trust, and global politics. And trust is harder to control than gold. But for now, the world accepted it. The dollar was safe. America had bought itself time. But time always runs out. And in the decades that followed, something unexpected happened. The very system that saved America began to slowly tear it apart. Debt skyrocketed. Wages stagnated. The cost of living climbed. America didn't feel richer. It felt heavier. A silent crisis was growing. Invisible at first, but unstoppable. That crisis was inflation, and it would lead to a day Americans would never forget. The petrodollar system had saved America, but it came with a hidden price. A price paid not by the government, but by ordinary Americans. People who worked long hours, yet somehow felt poorer every year. It began quietly. A few cents here, a few dollars there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. Just a slow rise in the cost of living. But economists have a name for this. The silent tax. Inflation. By the late 1970s, it was no longer silent. Inflation didn't just creep, it exploded. Gas prices doubled. Food prices soared. Interest rates hit nearly 20%. People couldn't buy homes. Businesses couldn't borrow money. Families felt crushed. Americans asked, "Why does everything cost more, but my paycheck stays the same?" It wasn't just bad economics. It was the side effect of America's new financial system. Because once the dollar was no longer backed by gold, there was nothing stopping the U.S. from printing as many dollars as it needed. The government didn't need more gold. It only needed more paper. And the more dollars they printed, the less each dollar was worth. One man saw it coming. And he wasn't an economist. He wasn't banker. He wasn't a politician. He was a founding father. Thomas Jefferson once warned, "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless." It sounded dramatic, but history was proving him right. The 1970s became known as the Great Inflation. It nearly broke the American economy. And then came the moment that changed everything. A man named Paul Volcker walked into the Federal Reserve. He had one mission: kill inflation at any cost. And he did. By raising interest rates to the highest levels in U.S. history. Mortgage rates hit 18%. Credit cards, over 20%. Jobs were lost. Companies collapsed. The economy fell into recession. But inflation finally broke. America survived. Painfully. Barely. But it lived on. And when the smoke cleared, the U.S. discovered something powerful. It could control the world. With its currency alone, the dollar didn't just become America's money. It became the world's money. And that was the turning point. Because from that day on, America didn't just export cars, or food, or technology. It began exporting debt. And the world started buying it. Willingly. Nations invested in U.S. bonds. Foreign companies borrowed in U.S. dollars. Global markets depended on American interest rates. The dollar was no longer just a currency. It was a weapon. But every weapon has recoil. And one day, someone would fire back. By the 1990s, America wasn't just the world's strongest military. It was the world's financial empire. The dollar was everywhere. In banks, in trade, in savings, in oil, in global debt. America had discovered something extraordinary. When your currency is the world's currency, you don't have to conquer nations. You can control them, financially. And that changed everything. Instead of tanks, America used sanctions. Instead of invasions, it used interest rates. Instead of soldiers, it used the power of the dollar. When a foreign leader challenged U.S. influence, their assets could be frozen overnight. They could be cut off from the global banking system. Their people could suffer without a single shot fired. The dollar was now the most powerful weapon on earth. But in the shadows, someone was watching. Someone who wanted that power for themselves. Enter China. When China saw the U.S. using its currency as a geopolitical tool, they began asking a dangerous question. What happens if one day we build a world that doesn't need the dollar? And they weren't alone. Russia asked it. Iran asked it. Even U.S. allies began asking it quietly. Because with every sanction America placed, with every country it financially isolated, the world got one message loud and clear. If you rely on the dollar, you also rely on America's permission. And most nations don't like needing permission. So quietly, plans began to form. Meetings happened behind closed doors. New alliances were made. Unlikely partnerships emerged. China started making trade deals directly in their own currency, the yuan. Russia joined them. India tested it. Saudi Arabia even began considering it. Countries began buying gold again. Central banks worldwide started reducing their dollar reserves. Little by little, confidence began shifting. Even the International Monetary Fund, the organization that once helped design the dollar-dominated financial system, issued a warning. The era of unquestioned dollar dominance is beginning to fade. The dollar wasn't dying, but for the first time in decades, it was being challenged. Why? Because every empire creates the conditions for its own decline. Just like Rome taxed too heavily, just like Britain struggled to maintain control, America's greatest strength, the dollar, was also becoming its greatest vulnerability. But here's the twist. America's collapse will not begin with an invasion, or a revolution, or a protest. It will begin quietly, in a place most Americans have never heard of, the bond market. The one place where fear spreads fastest, where trust matters most, where the value of America can fall in a single day. And one day, that almost happened. A moment in history that few people remember, but nearly triggered the most destructive economic crisis in U.S. history. A day when the dollar almost died. It happened in 2008, a year that started like any other, but ended with a question that terrified the world. Is the American dollar still safe? It began with banks. Banks that were too big to fail. Banks that gambled billions and lost. When they fell, they didn't fall alone. They dragged the world with them. Stock markets crashed. Jobs vanished. Retirement accounts evaporated overnight. Families lost their homes. Credit dried up. And suddenly, people began asking a question that hadn't been asked in decades. What if the world stops trusting the U.S.? Because behind every loan, behind every mortgage, behind every global trade, was the same foundation, the dollar. And if that foundation cracked, everything would collapse. So Washington did something unthinkable. They printed money. Not millions. Not billions. Trillions. Banks were rescued. Bailouts were issued. Stimulus checks went out. Debt exploded. The Federal Reserve stepped in and began buying the government's own bonds just to keep the system alive. It worked, but at a cost. Because when the government prints money, it doesn't create wealth. It creates debt. The bill gets passed. to future generations. The U.S. national debt skyrocketed, past $10 trillion, and it never came back down. By 2020, it passed $25 trillion. Today, it's over $34 trillion, and rising every second. But here's the truth no politician likes to say. The U.S. is not planning to pay this debt back. It can't. It never will. Instead, it hopes the same trick. We'll keep working, print money, and pray the world still believes in it. But the world has started to question it. China is selling U.S. bonds. Russia no longer uses dollars. Saudi Arabia is talking deals with China in yuan. And when countries trade without dollars, something even more dangerous happens. America loses leverage. No leverage means less power, less control, less influence. And someday, if more countries walk away from the dollar, the U.S. will face the moment it has feared for decades: the return of the bill, the end of the free ride, the collapse of trust. That is the day the dollar could truly die. But here's the twist. Every crisis is also an opportunity. Empires rise, empires fall, but those who prepare, those who understand history, don't get crushed by it. They survive it. They benefit from it. They lead the world that comes next. So the real question is not, will the dollar collapse? The real question is, will you be ready if it does? If this video gave you a new way of seeing America's future, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because history isn't just something that happened. It's something that's happening right now. And it's shaping your future. This is not the end of the story. This is only the beginning.